I'm Adam Posen. I'm president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you for what I think is going to be one of the most important and certainly one of the most substantively engaging events anyone is holding this Spring Bank Fund Meetings Week. We are delighted today to welcome our colleagues from our close cousin, not quite a sister, but I'll call it a cousin institute, Bruegel. Their founding and outgoing director, Jean Pisani-Ferry, deputy director, Guntram Wolf, senior fellow, Andre Sapir, all old friends of the Institute and many people in this room, who've done the first real independent assessment of the Troika's conditionality in Southern Europe. And this is obviously an important issue which independence and objectivity matter, but where also criticism should not be raised just for criticism's sake. It's worth a historical note that the very first publication our institute ever put out, I believe, was John Williamson's book on IMF conditionality. So it's kind of a nice symmetry to be able to export our model to Bruegel in Europe, even if it's undergone a bit of change. The people who are speaking today, we are delighted and honored, frankly, that some of the senior-most officials representing the Troika have come to openly discuss and explain their positions and respond to the Bruegel report. This includes Reza Moghadam, head of the European Department at the IMF, Jorg Asmussen from the ECB's Governing Council, and Servas de Roos from the top of DG ECFIN at the European Commission, thereby 3 heads being better than 1. Oh, good, someone like that. I finally, just to say that we don't defer to anyone in our own working on Europe and European issues. Our own Jacob von Kierkegaard will provide a few remarks from his American sort of perspective. I'm not going to bother introducing anyone further or motivating this because we have such senior people and we want to give them all a chance to talk. Unfortunately, even though Andre and Guntram are full co-authors with Jean of this report, for reasons of time, we're only going to ask John to speak. John's going to come up and do no more than 20 minutes representing the report, hopefully a little less. And then I will ask the Troika members and Jacob to come up to the panel and each give their remarks. So thank you very much, Jean.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be back at the Institute with you as a schoolmaster. And I'm very happy to have graduated from little sister to cousin on that day. That's very good for Bruegel. The study I'm going to present, as you said, was done with Andre and Guntram. And it's a follow-up to a study we did at that time commissioned by the fund on IMF surveillance of the euro area. And we thought, this time not being commissioned by anyone, that it was natural to try to continue and assess the programs. We're fully aware that it's very early in the game to make such an assessment, that this endeavor is fraught with many difficulties of methodology, or what are the counterfactual, the story is not written yet, etc. But at the same time, we thought that there's so much debate, there are so many questions about the effectiveness of those Troika programs that it was time to start a serious discussion, even on the basis of incomplete evidence. So that's what I'm going to present. And what we start from is the fact that there were 2 major challenges at the start. One was to achieve an adjustment within monetary union, which is more than just under fixed exchange rates. Under fixed exchange rates, there is some experience, but there are a set of conditions: full capital mobility, no monetary financing, fiscal rules. I mean, a set of conditions that are specific to EMU, that are particularly challenging for an adjustment. And the second innovation was obviously this creation of the Troika, what everybody calls the Troika, so the EU, IMF cooperation, and the fact that the EU was represented in this Troika by 2 institutions. So what we're trying to do is to do 2 things, basically. One is to look at the program outcomes, without looking too much at who did what within the Troika. So, what is it in terms of a particular program under these conditions, and try to draw lessons. And the other one is to look at the institutional setup and how it worked and what are the lessons to be drawn from these arrangements for the future, for the EU and beyond, for the cooperation between the IMF and regional entities. So we compare this program with other programs. We compare program outcomes with predictions. We also had some interviews with policymakers, with members of the Troika, but obviously all the assessments are our own. Okay, let me skip that because basically I said that. So what is special in the crisis within the euro area? So the number of economic constraints, some of which are obvious. Fixed exchange rate again, large cross-border exposure and capital mobility. Let me just show you this graph on cross-border assets and liabilities. The red line is for euro area countries. So conditions of very high cross-border capital mobility and exposure. And as I said, there is prohibition of monetary financing. There are policy constraints. We had no institution in charge of providing assistance to start with when the crisis erupted. There was no experience with it. So therefore, we thought, and actually André and I wrote at an early stage a paper saying IMF should come in because this is the only solution, the only realistic solution. And there are legal constraints also, not least for the financial assistance to sovereigns. There's been a whole controversy in Europe about the legality of this kind of assistance. And there are legal constraints on the side of the Commission, which is bound by the treaty, to enforce EU policy in its various roles, including as member of the Troika. So these are special conditions. And the consequences of it were first that these programs had to be tailored to meet the budgetary need of the countries, the gross financing needs of the sovereigns. So it's quite different from a standard program where you start from the balance of payment. Here, the balance of payment is almost automatically financed, at least on an ex-post basis, by the euro system, because the capital outflow they were completely offset by program money and by Eurosystem money, and that shows up in the target 2 balances. But at the same time, there were severe constraints for the sovereigns, not least because they didn't have access to any central bank financing because of the no monetary financing clause. So in a way, in this program, everything had to be tailored in a way that the financing of the sovereign was made by the program, and that determines the size of the program. The residual balance of payment financing was provided by the euro system, not automatically, whatever the amount, because the euro system was able to monitor the access to liquidity through the various windows, the normal windows, the ELA, and therefore exercise a constraint on the supply of credit. But that's how it worked, and that was a particular setup. Implication also is that since the nominal exchange rate cannot be changed, the real exchange rate has to be targeted through structural reforms, through measures that foster wage price flexibility and basically shift or move the Phillips curve. So that was overall the setup of those programs. And an illustration is given by this table in which you see how the financing needs were determined. Basically, you started from the government deficit, projected government deficit, debt amortization, and you added all dimensions, all components. And this determined over the program period what is the amount of financing that is required. Consequences, if you work the other way around, by having the amount of the financing, you have the degree of fiscal restriction. There must be, whatever in nominal terms, whatever actually the real condition in the economy, whatever the tax receipt, there is a serious constraint there. So that was the economics of the program. This is an illustration of this balance of payment financing by the Eurosystem, just for clarity. The blue curve is total capital inflows in the case of Greece, but it's the same for other countries. So essentially, they were private until 2008. Then private capital started to flow out. It was substituted by what? By the green part, which is the Eurosystem money, and by the blue part, which is the program money. And even to a situation where there were net capital outflows compared to the initial condition that was 2002, they were entirely substituted and beyond by program and Eurosystem money. So that's the way it worked. Consequence, those programs are extremely large. They're extremely large, even if you count only the IMF money. Though there are data on size and length on the left compared to other standard programs, Asian crisis, Latin American crisis. So both in terms of size and length, it's more. And on the right side, you have the relative and absolute size. So the level, the y-axis gives a share of GDP. The size of the bubble is in terms of US dollar. And you see again that this big bubble is Greece. And so Greece, by any standard, and even counting only the 1/3 that corresponds to the IMF, was much beyond traditional programs. Initial conditions were also affected by very large debts and deficits. So we compare here also initial condition to other programs. You started with such a very adverse condition in terms of debt and deficit, so which put necessarily the fiscal issue at the core. They were also affected by negative international investment positions and real exchange rate rigidity. I mean, nominal exchange rate rigidity is by definition, but real exchange rate also in terms of the degree of flexibility. Look at the graph at the bottom. On the left part, you have the real exchange rate in a series of programs. So the green is Asian crisis, the blue is Latin America, and the light blue is the euro area, where you see that there is no change in the real exchange rate compared to a standard program where there is a major change in the real exchange rate. So those are the economic conditions they had to deal with. Now, assessment. I'm not going to go into each and every country. You find it in the report. We do it by country, but here I'm going to just highlight a few common threads. First, well, the economic development were generally worse than expected in terms of GDP. Much worse, obviously, in the case of Greece. But in general, there was more of a drop of domestic demand than expected if you compare results to what was expected at the start of the program. And you had a major difference in terms of unemployment. Unemployment was expected to behave in a much more favorable manner, and that's across all three countries. Question is why? Part of it is because perhaps, labor markets, it's more difficult to assess. Part of which is also because in all those three countries you had highly labor-intensive sectors that collapsed. Housing, traditional services, highly labor-intensive, they collapsed. And this had a disproportionate effect on the labor market that was not taken into account sufficiently at the start. So over and above the growth effect, you had the labor market effect that was major. On the fiscal side, relatively good surprises. In spite of economic developments, and performance that was not necessarily great in terms of debt, but at least in terms of deficit, better than expected. So that can be also interpreted as a result of this tight constraint on the financing of the budget deficit. Current account, better than expected performance. And that's across all three countries. They did better than was expected. So let me go a bit into some of these aspects in more detail. So that's unemployment rates compared to standard program. So the blue line that goes above, that's for the euro area, the three euro area countries. On the left panel, on the right panel, that's the three countries. So you see what I said, that unemployment developed much worse. Second, on the public finances. Here I look specifically at the Greek case, and we did a sort of decomposition of why is it that we had a much more adverse debt development than expected. Well, reasons were, and you look at the red rectangle on the right, part of it was worse initial conditions. After the program started, numbers were revealed that were worse than expected in terms of the level of debt, 15% more debt to GDP ratio. A very large part of it was adverse macro development, lower nominal GDP, that had a denominator effect and imply a much higher debt to GDP ratio. And that offset the effect of the debt restructuring when it came. I'm not speaking of the present value of the whole debt restructuring, but the effect on the debt at the moment where we're observing the debt. And taken all these elements together, this is the reason why you had these very adverse debt developments. So it's not mainly that there were slippages, it's mainly that there were economic developments and initial conditions that were worse. Now, on the current account, we looked at what was expected and what was the result. So for each of the three countries, on the right you have what was projected at the start, and on the left you have the actual outcome. Ireland in the middle, the IMF expected higher exports, so an improvement through exports, and it actually took place. And it expected, in fact, that imports would increase. In fact, import contracted, so the outcome was better than expected. For the two other countries, Greece and Portugal, the improvement in exports did not take place, or it took place to a much lesser extent than expected. And what happened is that there was domestic demand contraction that explained the better performance, but that was not due to better export performance, that was essentially due to the collapse of domestic demand. So that's what we find. Overall, so just to sum up, larger fall in domestic demand and output than expected, much worse on unemployment, worse debt ratios in spite of fiscal effort, and a better current account position. I explain why. Now, differences across countries, obviously Greece stands apart. Ireland is the good case with real exchange rate improvement, export performance, better economic outlook. And Portugal is much better than Greece on implementation, but we find there are structural weaknesses and worries for growth going forward. So success or failure, a judgment call. Success is that there was no exit. Success is that there are prospects for market access, at least for Ireland and also hopefully Portugal. Failures, I mentioned them, the economic outcome. And the political sustainability of the program going forward, that is a question that remains open if you look at political developments in the countries. What could have been done differently? Hard to say, we don't have counterfactuals. We discuss, well, first, the lack of time consistency of the European stance, constant changes in the conditions, in the terms of lending, in the stance vis-à-vis restructuring, etc., that didn't make things easy neither for the countries nor for the Troika team. Second, well, the economic environment in the rest of the EU was not conducive to success, even though it does not explain, you cannot ascribe to adverse external developments what happened. But certainly it was not thought as a major adjustment issue for the euro area as a whole that would have required change in euro area policies. It was thought as something that had to be addressed through changes in the country's policies. Third, early restructuring for Greece, we think it would have helped. And senior creditors bail-in for Ireland, it would have helped to a lesser extent. I mean, quantitatively it would have been less, but nevertheless it's something. Fiscal devaluation, the bet was that structural reform would deliver the improvement in the real exchange rate. Structural reforms, there was a lag in implementation, there were problems in implementation, and the lag between implementation and the economic effect. So this was a bet on the ability to, over time, to achieve goals through structural reforms. The sort of shortcut through fiscal devaluation, in part because obviously there was no fiscal space was not really considered. Then the whole debate on austerity boils down to a debate on financing, because for the reason we gave, if you want less austerity, you have to provide more financing, and the limits to it. Institutional issues, and I'm going to end with that, trying to keep within time limit. The Troika setup was without precedent. IMF cooperation with regional entity and an entity which was itself two-headed, a commission with a broad mandate, much beyond the remit of the programs, and a central bank that was sitting on the side of the creditors instead of traditionally in a program negotiation to sit on the side of the debtor. The Troika, it's important to realize, is not a decision-making institution. It's not a lending institution. Each of the participants keeps its autonomy. An IMF program is an IMF program. There is no cross-conditionality. There is a conditionality on the EU side, which is much more structural. So obviously they are linked. They are linked through the financing. So the fact that, if you want to have the overall financing, you need to have conditions met on both sides. But it's just sort of bringing together of different conditionality. It's not a troika lending. The three partners don't have the same role. The IMF is what we call a vertically integrated institution that does program negotiation and monitoring, that does the decision, that decides on assistance and that lends. On the European side, so this is fragmented. We have the two institutions I've mentioned, but we have also the most important institution, the Eurogroup, which is the decision-making institution on lending. So it's a much more complex setup on the European side. And this dialogue between the vertically integrated institution and a series of institutions that are coordinated more or less with each other is not the easiest thing in the program. Assessing the Troika, well, we have no doubt this was necessary to put together something of this sort. As I said, we were in favor of IMF involvement. There was an issue of financing. There was an issue of technology transfer. It's not something you learn in the textbooks. You have to have an experience on the ground to do it. So I think this was a good thing to have the Troika. It was probably less problematic than expected by some at the start. Now there are big questions going forward. What are these questions? First, questions for the IMF. For the IMF, the first question is the equality of treatment between Euro area members and other countries. And that's something, obviously, all the IMF members are sensitive about. There was a particular issue which was exceptional access policy criterion. Normally, the IMF lends to a country where there is a high probability of sustainability. To lend to Greece, they had to change the rule and to add, unless this country is systemically important. And that applied to Greece and then to other countries. So there was a change in the rules specifically for this purpose. And more generally, there's a perception among IMF constituencies that there is an issue of equality of treatment. And obviously, you can dwell on this and consider that it is because the Europeans have so much weight in the IMF that they got favorable conditions, etc. That's one issue. There are another series of issues. The superposition of conditionality is not easy. IMF had a philosophy on parsimonious conditionality, and to say the least, about the conditionality that is applied to Euro area countries is not parsimonious. There's a question of the decision-making procedures. There's a question of resources. I have here the graphs on the share of Europe in IMF lending. It's enormous. And there's a question of who has the senior role and who has the junior role, with the IMF being a junior lender. The question for the Commission is essentially that it is much more than a lending institution. It is much more than a condition-setting institution. Actually, it's not a lending institution. In this particular instance, the Commission is the agent of the Eurogroup. And it's a very strange situation. The staff of the Commission is there and exercise conditionality, but the principal is the Eurogroup. It's not the College of the Commission. So the Commission as a political entity doesn't have ownership of the programs because it doesn't have a decision on the program. So you can see commissioners having different views because they were never asked to vote on those programs. So it's a sort of very particular situation that puts the Commission staff in an uncomfortable situation, and there are risks of conflict of interest and political risks. ECB is difficult to assess because the other institutions, they write, they produce documents, etc. ECB does not produce documents. So it's more on ex ante judgment or ideas of what happened on the ground. The ECB has its own instruments. It's important to realize that the ECB is part, it does not lend, but it has its own instruments, and its own instruments are extremely important. So the ELA is an extremely important instrument in the economy of a program. The OMT may be also. So it is there, it is participating in the negotiation, but it does not lend, and it has its instruments of its own. So it's a sort of a difficult, complex situation, and there are potential conflicts of interest that I'm not going to detail in the interest of time between the monetary policy and the liquidity policy role of the ECB and what it does. Now, going forward, what do we recommend? We think IMF should be there as long as euro area governance remains incomplete. There are three options. One that would be IMF would become a provider of technical assistance. Second, that IMF would keep an important lending role. Third, and this is what we advocate, that it would become a catalytic lender with some 10% of the financing, an ability to walk out if it does not agree without putting in jeopardy the whole financing, but signaling effect of taking part. Euro area side and Commission. We think there should be a rethink of the role of the Commission. There are two solutions to neat solution. One is to give the Commission a full role as a Commission. The other one is to build a European Monetary Fund, a specific institution to which the Commission fund could be seconded, but this institution would take responsibility. It would be a sort of counterpart of the IMF. And we advocate the second solution because we think that a situation where the Commission has both roles is uncomfortable. And finally, on the ECB, what we advocate is that the ECB should, for reason of having access to information, for reasons of being able to voice concerns, it should still take part in those missions, but it should be a mostly silent partner, so that it should not sign anything, and it should basically limit itself to what is clearly its role, without being part, for example, on all discussion on structural conditionality, which are really not its main its remit. That's basically it. We advocate improving accountability, and we say also that there are lessons to be drawn from the rest for the rest of the world, but that I'm going perhaps to go back to in the discussion. Sorry.
Thank you, Jean.